I Will Make You Proud by Wheredoesshego. Trigger warning. This fic includes talk of abuse, talk of suicide, and potential sexual content. Please read with care. Chapter 5. Hermione, May 2006. The next morning, Hermione stood outside the office of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and took a deep, steadying breath. She smoothed down the material of her skirt, tucked in her blouse, and purposefully marched into the office, hoping that she didn't look as awful as she felt. She hadn't managed to sleep at all. The image of Draco Malfoy had permeated her consciousness, not allowing sleep to come. She had eventually got up around 5 a.m., groggy and sad, with an overwhelming feeling of being too late, having missed something before she'd even begun. Hermione was angry with herself for letting Malfoy's death affect her so much. Hadn't her training explicitly taught her how to separate the person from the case? She thought maybe she needed to start occluding when she worked on Malfoy's investigation to help with some of the emotions it had stirred up, but she always felt like using occlumency made her a bad aura. It took away who she was and prevented her from resonating with the person she was investigating. It made her too removed. One of the many reasons that Hermione had climbed so high within her department was her ability to see the situation from multiple points of view, to play devil's advocate, and to examine angles that other people wouldn't have even considered. She felt like this case was going to take all of her skills, that there was so much they weren't seeing already. She had a million questions and felt desperate to take a look at Malfoy's memories to find out more about where he had been, and more to the point, who he had been. She asked Katie to put the diaries on her desk as soon as they were released. They would be a good place to start. As she walked through the office, Hermione saw Blaise was already at his desk. His head was down, eyes scouring the document he had in front of him. She stopped and leaned on his desk, waiting for him to look up. When he eventually did, Hermione was concerned to see dark circles around his eyes. The lack of color in his face, his usual playful demeanor, was nowhere in sight. He looked tired and troubled. She didn't think he'd been open to answering many questions yet. "Blaise," Hermione began. "What's going on? Are you okay?" He indicated the document he was looking at, waving his hand over it and rubbing at his tired eyes irritably. "This is the preliminary autopsy report on Malfoy," he said, his voice flat and expressionless. "They've just documented the external and immediate findings." He looked back down at it, and it didn't say anything else, just confirmed, rubbing his hands over his face, an expression of anger and disbelief evident in his features. Hermione came around to his side of the desk and bent over so that she could see the document. It was charmed to show an outline of Draco Malfoy, as though he were lying flat, one front view and another from the back. These were commonly used by auras when investigating deaths. The medical staff used a spell to show injuries on the body. This was a quick way to confirm a cause of death if they already had a good idea of what had happened, or if the cause was somewhat obvious. They would perform more in-depth searches in the coming days, looking for spell work, curses, and cutting open the cadaver to study the internal injuries. Hermione's eyes widened as she looked down at the report. Lit up throughout Malfoy's body were the various notable injuries he had sustained during the course of his life. Different colors indicating severity of the injury and also how recent they were. There were different colors depending on whether they were possible cause of death, healed or fresh, historical, self-inflicted, or otherwise. Blaise looked heartsick, his lips pressed together in a tight, pale line. "He's lit up like a fucking Christmas tree," he said, the anger back again. Blaise was not exaggerating. There seemed to be very little space on Draco Malfoy's body that was not lit up. She glimpsed a dark red patch over his shoulder and thought back to his encounter with Buckbeak, the hippogriff, during their 3rd year at Hogwarts. She had told Hagrid to take Malfoy to the hospital wing after Buckbeak had attacked him, but they had all rolled their eyes at him writhing on the floor in agony, thinking that he had been putting it on for Hagrid's benefit. Hermione had firmly believed that Malfoy deserved the attack, and that the injury had not been that serious, but the document indicated differently. Looking at it, she was surprised that Malfoy hadn't needed more treatment. It showed that his arm had been broken at the shoulder joint, and also there was a hairline fracture in the humerus. She couldn't remember that at all, and was now less surprised by Lucius Malfoy's reaction to the injury. She knew he had been furious that anyone dared hurt his precious son. She just hadn't realized that he had been hurt quite so badly. She let her eyes rest over the rest of the report, wanting to study his other injuries, but Blaise suddenly whipped the paper away and put it in his desk drawer. "I can't look at that anymore," he said. "Coffee?" Hermione glanced at him. Something in his demeanor was off. He wasn't himself. As she returned to her own desk to drop her things off, she made a mental note to speak to Ginny after work and see how Blaise had been at home. She supposed she shouldn't be surprised. She knew they had been friends as children, and even if that friendship had ended, Blaise probably still had a lot of memories of Malfoy to work through. It was clearly an emotional time for him, regardless of what had happened as they had grown older. She wondered whether she should speak to Harry about the appropriateness of Blaise staying on the case, but realized that she, too, had a previous relationship with Malfoy. Many of the auras in her department did. For some reason, Hermione didn't want to let this case go. This was her case. She didn't trust anyone else to investigate it as thoroughly as she would. So she decided to say nothing. Both she and Blaise were consummate professionals. They would both be able to put their emotions aside to do the job. Quite frankly, Hermione thought they'd have to. This was the highest profile case of her career. If she wanted to advance, she needed to do well. She needed to find out what had led Malfoy to the Hog's Head and find the answers to the questions already being shouted from the front page of the Prophet. Someone had put a copy of the paper down at the front desk, and she had picked it up on her way in. The front page screamed its headline. "Draco Malfoy, dead. Former Death Eater and wanted murderer Draco Malfoy was found dead this morning at the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade. Early reports indicate he was found hanged. There are questions as to whether he killed himself or was murdered. This reporter believes murder to be the most likely cause. There are many who would have liked to see Malfoy dead, including the families of his countless victims, none of whom stood a chance against his powerful dark wizard. In recent years, Malfoy has been on the run following the brutal murder of his own father, Lucius Malfoy. There are many theories as to the reason for the younger Malfoy's heinous act, not less in order to gain access to the notorious Malfoy vault. Narcissa Malfoy is currently unavailable to comment due to her incarceration at St. Mungo's Hospital, where she is reportedly being treated for trauma-induced psychosis after witnessing her precious son murder her husband in front of her eyes. The question remains as to where Draco Malfoy has been hiding out whilst on his campaign of terror. Indeed, it is believed that there have been those who have harbored this fugitive, despite knowing his despicable actions. The best auras in Britain are now on the case, and no doubt those responsible for facilitating Draco Malfoy's murderous regime will face the justice that he himself has managed to escape. Hermione stopped reading and huffed as she looked at the byline. Rita Skeeter. Obviously. She knew Malfoy's death would be the biggest story for weeks to come. Draco Malfoy had been tabloid fodder almost his whole life, much as she, Harry, and Ron also had. When Harry and Ron first came out with their relationship in 2004, the papers had had a field day. She had been painted as the jealous ex, a woman scorned, and it almost made them laugh with the ridiculousness of it. Hermione had truly never been happier for two people than she had been when Harry finally decided he wasn't able to hide the nature of his relationship with his best friend any longer. Hermione knew Ron had struggled more with opening himself up publicly, concerned about how his parents would react to the inevitable media circus, but he hadn't needed to be. Molly had been overjoyed, claiming that she had known for years and that Harry was like a son to her anyways. It hadn't taken her long to start asking Ron when Harry would become a son-in-law, causing Ron's ears to turn pink and him to stammer out, "Study on, Mum," whilst refusing to meet Harry's eye. Arthur Weasley was quieter in his acceptance of the relationship, but he had gone out of his way to support Harry with his application to progress through the Aura rankings. And they had the couple to dinner most weekends, along with Ginny, Blaise, and Hermione. Hermione and Ron had a short-lived relationship whilst in their last year of school, but it hadn't been serious for either of them. She just hadn't felt the spark there, and clearly neither had he. Hermione had often felt like she played second fiddle to Harry in Ron's eyes. And it had actually been a relief when he had tearfully admitted his feelings to her over several drinks one evening. The love between Harry and Ron made Hermione's heart feel like it would burst. Since Ron's emotional confession and Harry's immediate reciprocation, they had become even more inseparable than they had been previously. They were the ultimate team. She loved spending time at their house, watching the dynamic between the two of them, and hoping she'd find a big love of her own one day. Harry's green eyes followed Ron around the room, the corners crinkling with laughter when Ron grumbled about losing something or moaned good-naturedly about his mother's meddling. Harry was the more domesticated of the two. He had given up trying to teach Ron to cook years before, and was most definitely the chef of the household. Hermione had spent many an evening sitting, sipping red wine at their cozy kitchen, whilst Harry cooked, smelling the delicious aromas coming from the stovetop, and listening as Ron regaled them with the hilarious stories from Hogwarts, where he was the most recent Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. His reputation as 1/3 of the Golden Trio had preceded him. Ron was in equal parts loved and revered by his students. Hermione was still struggling to wrap her head around the fact that Ron Weasley was in charge of educating other people's children. The Prophet had run a news story about them almost daily for months following the revelation of Harry and Ron's fledgling romance. The stories unpacked everything notable they had ever done, looking for signs of unrequited love between Harry and Ron, and detailing all the ways Hermione had been overlooked. She had been almost incandescent with rage as she had read yet another article describing how she clung on to the two men in desperation, seeing as no other man would have her. She was described as being far too independent for her own good, her intelligence and ferocity being off-putting for any self-respecting wizard, not to mention the fact that she had been putting it about since her 4th-year relationship with Victor Crumb. Ron had spluttered with laughter at that, causing Hermione to hit him with her copy of The Prophet. Harry had given her a tight hug and told her to ignore it, and that she had to know Rita would always be gunning for her, and to put it down to where it came from. Hermione found that to be much easier said than done. Interspersed with the copious amounts of articles about herself, Ron, and Harry, there had been more than a few written about Draco Malfoy. Before his father's murder, the articles had been about his eligibility, whom he was dating, how he had styled his hair, what designer robes he was wearing. Malfoy had grown up to be an exceptionally handsome young man. His white blonde hair, silver eyes, and wolf-like smile befuddling many a young witch and wizard. The prophet seemed perfectly happy to overlook his Death Eater status and painted him as a hero. He had rid the world of Voldemort. Never mind how he had done it. For his part, Malfoy had seemed to have no interest in courting the media, and many of the candid shots of him had been taken from a distance, as he would shy away from cameras if he saw them. Hermione remembered being shocked at how handsome he had grown up to be. His pointy features and narrow shoulders had made for a tall, well-built physique, and yes, she had to admit a beautifully chiseled face. His lips were full, his hair looked soft, and his skin was immaculate. All that changed, though, after the vicious murder of Lucius Malfoy. The brutality of the murder had been leaked to the press and had made for shocking reading. Malfoy was now written about with fear, reverence, painted as a beautiful devil, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was pictured scowling, malevolent, snatched photos of him as he had been marched in handcuffs from the manor, soaked in his father's blood. The pictures of his bloodied hands and shirts stayed with Hermione long after she'd seen them. He had had blood running down his face, the silver of his eyes staring wildly out at the red splatters covering him. He even had blood staining the blonde of his hair. Those pictures had shocked the wizarding community. Malfoy had looked absolutely monstrous. The fact that he escaped custody shortly after had sent the general public into a wild panic. The articles about him had come in thick and fast ever since. There hadn't been many pictures, mostly blurry, ambiguous images that might or might not have been him, snatched shots of the back of his head or a cloaked figure amongst numerous reports of unconfirmed sightings. Hermione folded the paper with a sigh and hid it from Blaze's view as he reached her desk, and they made their way to the cafe for a coffee. As they settled themselves at a table 10 minutes later, Hermione watched Blaze closely. He looked so unhappy. She had never seen Blaze to be anything other than exuberant and full of humor. He could find the fun in any situation. Blaze was truly one of her favorite people in the world. She was grateful every day that not only did she get to work with him, but that he was also in a relationship with her best friend. Ginny and Blaze had been engaged for just over a year. The relationship was sometimes tumultuous but passionate. Hermione often found it difficult to be stuck in the middle of them during a fight, but even harder to be with them when they made up, when they were all over each other. They barely concealed passion, making her blush as she sat next to them on Molly Weasley's squishy sofa. Blaze placed the coffees down on the table along with a plain croissant for her and a pain au chocolat for him. They sat for a while in easy silence, sipping their coffees, and she watched as he picked at his pastry. He clearly had no appetite. She cleared her throat. I was thinking today of conducting some preliminary interviews with people known to have been close to Malfoy. He raised an eyebrow. I thought you were desperate to start looking at the memories in those books. I am, she replied, but I'm waiting for them to be released into evidence, and then I need a slot at the Pensive. Harry is taking a look at Garrus Flint's recollection this morning, before he's released from custody. Blaze nodded. Yes, he's asked me to go in with him for that. He took a sip of his coffee. Who are you planning to speak to? Hermione took her notepad from her pocket and flicked through the notes she had made earlier that morning as she paced in her living room at 5 a.m. after giving up on going back to sleep. I'm planning on visiting Theodore Knott and Pansy Parkinson first. They were known associates of Malfoy's right up until his father's murder, and also, their house isn't far from here. I can go there and get back in time for my slot at the Pensive at 12. Blaise paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Theo and Pansy, what are you expecting them to tell you? I don't know. Anything? I want to know more about who he really was, not what the bloody prophet said about him. Blaise rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. If you really think they are worth speaking to, I doubt they know much. Isn't it a bit too soon? He only died yesterday. Hermione narrowed her eyes slightly as she studied him. Blaise looked firmly down at the table, not meeting her gaze. She just could not get a handle on what was going on in his head. Blaise was being shifty, his usual open face so closed, guarded. Hermione felt guilty for thinking it, but she was sure he was hiding something from her. She reached a hand across the table. Are you sure you're okay, Blaise? This case seems to be getting to you. He finally raised his eyes to hers. I'm fine. I just have a bad feeling, that's all, he said eventually. I think Draco Malfoy had secrets, dark secrets, that I'm not sure we truly want to know the answer to. An hour later, Hermione was crossing the road on her way to Theodore Knott and Pansy Parkinson's huge townhouse. As she approached the beautiful house, she felt the usual unwelcome twist of bitterness in her stomach. The pure-blood witches and wizards still enjoyed the finer things in life, despite their parents' Death Eater status and Voldemort's death. If there was one thing that never changed in the wizarding world, it was the fact that money brought influence. None of the families associated with Voldemort has seemed to truly pay the price for their past crimes. These two appeared to be living a life of luxury. The house oozed money, sophistication, even from the outside. She approached the door and rapped the heavy knocker in what she thought was a decisive, businesslike manner. She waited as she heard brisk footsteps approach the door. It swung open, and Pansy Parkinson stood before her. Her hair was still her trademark sleek black bob, her clothes expensively tailored, a fitted black dress, and seam tights, a pair of sharp stiletto heels on her feet. However, Hermione's eyes were drawn immediately to Pansy's puffy, tear-stained face. She had clearly been crying before coming to the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. She clenched a tissue between her fingers, and her breath hitched as she saw Hermione stood there. She said nothing as Theo came up behind her, his face also pale and worn. His dark blue eyes widened as he saw Hermione standing there, and he put his hand on Pansy's shoulder and squeezed. Granger, he muttered. How can we help you? She looked at the two of them. Her voice suddenly stuck in her throat. She was intruding on their grief. Maybe she had come too soon. I'm sorry to disturb you both, she stuttered out eventually. As you can probably guess, I'm here on behalf of the DMLE to ask you some questions regarding Draco Malfoy. Pansy's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to reply before Theo's hand tightened on her shoulder again. Yes, of course. Come in, he said, his voice level and polite. Pansy turned to look at him, her face tight with an emotion Hermione could not decipher. She stood back to allow Hermione to enter. Her eyes narrowed on Hermione, her gaze not leaving her for a second. Theo led Hermione down a long, shiny, tiled hallway, and Hermione took in the elegance, opulence of the townhouse. The tasteful, minimalist decor screamed money. She tried not to feel a stab of jealousy, but it came all the same. Pansy followed close behind them, practically breathing down Hermione's neck. Her skin prickled as she followed Theo's sweeping hand to the glass table in the center of the huge white marble-top kitchen and sat down on the black leather seat. The two of them stood, facing Hermione, neither of them saying a word. Pansy seemed to be breathing hard. Her eyes glinted as she faced Hermione. Theo was calmer, more controlled. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked in his crisp, cut glass accent. "Coffee? Water? A fire whiskey, perhaps?" No, thank you," Hermione replied, trying to keep her nerves out of her voice. "As I said, I'm investigating the death of Draco Malfoy. I'm aware that you both maintained a relationship with Mr. Malfoy from a young age, and I'm keen to find out anything you may possibly be able to share with me regarding his experience as a child, or anything you can tell me about his years on the run. I'm evidence gathering in the initial stages right now, obviously. Basically, anything you can tell me about how he came to be in the Hogshead, or anything regarding his father's murder or his actions afterwards would be helpful as we begin this investigation." Pansy's eyes had widened as Hermione spoke, the look on her face becoming more incredulous with every word she uttered. She suddenly stood up, slammed both hands on the table. "You really know nothing, do you?" she spat, her face red, eyes wild. Theo was instantly at her side, his hands on her wrist, a warning in his eyes. "Pansy." She shook him off, rounding on Hermione again. "You truly have no idea. How the hell—" Her words abruptly cut off as Theo almost shouted now, the loss of control making Hermione jump. "Pansy, stop!" He took hold of her by the shoulders and marched her away from Hermione to the adjacent room. Hermione felt herself shaking, but she moved quickly across the room to look through the small gap of the door. Pansy was crying now, deep, racking sobs. Theo had her in his arms, smoothing her hair, kissing her cheeks. Pans, I know it's hard. This is what he wanted. He wanted it like this." She sobbed even harder and clung to him, her chest heaving, her eyes looking up into his in desperation. "I can't do it, Theo. It's too much. She cut off as Theo looked towards the door and caught sight of Hermione. He kissed Pansy again and left the room, shutting the door behind him on Pansy as she stood, her hands limp by her sides, sobbing, though her heart was breaking. "Unfortunately, Miss Granger, I fear this is all too much for my wife. I'm going to need you to leave immediately." Hermione swallowed, moved by the level of Pansy's distress. She had always seemed such a cold, unfeeling girl at Hogwarts. Hermione had never seen her show weakness. She nodded weakly and allowed him to guide her to the door. He looked sadly at her as he saw her to the step, something impossible to read in his eyes, as though he were trying to tell her something. She opened her mouth to ask him if there was anything he could tell her, but before she could, he slammed the door into her face. She walked out to the road and looked back to the house. Pansy was silhouetted in the window, huge sobs racking her body. Theo swept back into the room and took her in his arms. She watched the two of them, stood in an embrace for several minutes, and as she looked, she was sure Theo was crying too.